is called the suzerain vassal contract. Everybody say suzerain. And everybody say vassal. Now, everyone in this room is either a suzerain or a vassal. Tell your neighbor, I'm a suzerain or a vassal. Pick one. You don't even know what they are. You don't know what they mean yet, okay? But you have to be one. So pick which one you want to be. You want to be a suzerain or you want to be a vassal? Okay, you want to be a vassal? The word suzerain means large, bigger, important, okay? It means larger. So a suzerain is a king. A suzerain is a landlord. A suzerain is a business owner or a land owner. Suzerain means larger. Vassal means what? Smaller. Okay? It's the employee versus the employer. It's the citizen versus the king. Okay? So God made a suzerain vassal contract with Israel about the dirt. About the dirt. Let me give you an understanding of how this worked in the ancient world. Let's say I own 1,000 acres of land and I farm it. And it's been in my family for generations. And every year I plant, every year I water, every year I harvest, and I eat the produce or I sell the produce. I am a farmer with 1,000 acres. But I have this employee that is rock star, that has great character, has great integrity, but comes from a poor family. And I think to myself, man, this family really deserves their own land, really deserves a way to make their family grow, make their financial future be stable. So this farmer might decide, I'm gonna give my employee 100 acres. 100 acres. I'm gonna give him 10% of my land. So in this contract, which one is the suzerain? The guy that owns 1,000 acres. Why? Because he has 1,000. And the vassal in this contract is who? The guy that owns, now is receiving the 100 acres. Now, a suzerain vassal contract contains conditions. Here are the two conditions. Your family must remain people of integrity and character. And number two, you must treat the land right. If I give you this 100 acres, I expect, as part of the contract, that you're going to remain a person of high character and you're going to treat the land right. Now, the suzerain is giving the 100 acres to the vassal forever. Now, he could have given it to him for 10 years or 15 years. He could give it to their family forever. This is now your land. You own it forever. But it is a suzerain vassal contract. So if your sons grow up and they're a bunch of hooligans and criminals, I, as the suzerain, can kick them off the land because they're not meeting the contract. Or if your sons or your daughters don't plant and water or harvest, or they overuse the land or they underuse the land, if they mistreat the land, I can force your family off the 100 acres because you're the vassal. I'm not going to take the land back into my ownership because I've given it to your family forever, but I can actually kick your family off the land until your next generation grows up and they're people of character and they're people who would treat the land well, and then I'm going to welcome them back onto their 100 acres. That make sense? Okay, that's a suzerain vassal contract. Well, that's the contract that God made with Israel. Because we know that God owns how much of the land of the world? He owns all the land. He created it, he formed it. But out of his goodness and out of his plan, he decided to give Israel some acreage. In fact, what's interesting, if you look at the conversation between God and Abraham back in the book of Genesis, when God describes the boundaries of the promised land, it's almost the whole circle that I have here. You can see the little tiny red sliver. That's what land Israel is occupying today, but actually all of inside the circle is what God gave to Israel. And he gave it to them in the time of Abraham. So they've actually had the land based on God's promise for like 4,000, 3,000 years. Okay? Now, what God is doing is he's telling them, this is the contract. Israel, I own all the land of the world. I am giving you the promised land. And I'm giving it to you as Jews for every generation. But you have to be people of character. And you have to treat the land right. And if you ever become immoral and unfaithful, if you ever start overusing the land or underusing the land, I, as God, have the right in the suzerain relationship to keep you, to take you off the land. Does that make sense? So, let's go back to the book of Leviticus. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, chapter 25. When it comes to how to treat the land, this is what God told them to do. Leviticus chapter 25 and verse 1. The Lord then spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I shall give you, then the land shall have a Sabbath to the Lord." The dirt will have a Sabbath. Verse 3, 6 years you will sow your field, and 6 years you will prune your vineyard and gather in its crops. But during the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath what? Rest. A Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field, nor prune your vineyard. Your harvest aftergrowth you shall not reap, and your grapes of untrimmed vines you shall not gather. The land shall have a sabbatical year. All of you shall have the Sabbath products of the land for food. In other words, in the 7th year, don't trim your orchards, don't till the ground. Whatever fruit is naturally comes out, grab it and eat it for food, but don't take care of the land. Let the dirt rest. Verse 6, you yourselves and your male and female slaves and your hired man and your foreigner resides, those who live as aliens with you, everybody should eat all the fruit that comes on the trees naturally. Verse 7, even your cattle and the animals that are in your land shall have all of its crops to eat. In other words, if wheat comes up in the field, let the cows eat the wheat. Don't till it, don't plant, don't water. Give it a year rest. What's amazing is God had promised in another place that during the 6th year, he would give them enough to last the 7th year. So every 7 years, they got a year sabbatical of work. Wouldn't that be great? Every 7th year, have a year off. Okay? You know what's amazing? God says the Sabbath rest is also a weekly routine or rhythm. So if you take 1 day a week off, you get 52 days a week off, which is like what, 7 weeks? And then every 7th year you got off. God wants us to rest, and he wants the people of Israel to rest. Now let's go forward in your Bible. Go to the right to 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Fast forward 700 years. Second Chronicles chapter 36, starting in verse 15. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them again and again by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they continually mocked the messengers of God. Talking about Israel, God's trying to get their attention because they're breaking the covenant, they're breaking the contract, and God is trying to get their attention, so he's sending prophet after prophet, messenger after messenger, but when the prophets show up, the people mock them. Verse 16, he continually mocked the messenger of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets until the wrath of the Lord arose against him, and there was no what? Remedy. There is a time when God's patience finally says enough is enough, and you've passed the point of no return, and there's no more remedy. Okay? Verse 17, therefore he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, who slew their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or infirm. That's the Chaldeans didn't. He gave them into his hands. And we keep going down there in verse 18. All the articles of the house of God were taken to the king of Babylon. That's Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 19, they burned the house of God and broke down the walls of Jerusalem and burned it, its fortified buildings, with fire, and destroyed all the valuable articles. And those who had escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon. And they were the servants to him and his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia. Here it is, verse 21. Why did this all happen? Verse 21, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land enjoyed its what? Sabbaths. Apparently, Israel stopped letting the land rest on the Sabbath year. And God took this contract seriously. Worked the dirt for 6 years, let it rest on the seventh. And Israel decided, no, we want the produce, we want the money, we want the income. So they kept tilling the ground year after year after year, and God said, no, no, no. And that's why it says there in verse 21, all the days of its desolation, it kept Sabbath until 70 years were complete. So God made Israel be off the land for every Sabbath year they didn't keep. Does that make sense? And how many years does it say they were removed from the land? 70. So how many Sabbaths did they not keep? 70. You following that? Okay. They were taken off the land for 70 years. 1 year for every Sabbath they didn't keep and let the land rest. Now, how many years does it take to build up 70 Sabbaths? Well, what's 70 times 7? Somebody yell it out. 490, okay? So God had been after Israel for how long? 490 years. Knock it off. Keep the contract. Because remember, the two reasons a suzerain can kick a vassal off the land is what? Bad character and mistreating the land. So God was perfectly legitimate after 490 years to kick Israel off the land for 70 years because they had been mistreating the land. Now, there were other things involved. There was immorality. There was all kinds of idolatry. So they were bad people too, okay? But that's why Israel was swept off the land. That's why God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to come down from Babylon and sweep the southern two tribes off of the land, and now all of Israel is off its land. Does that make sense? Okay? When God makes a contract, he takes it pretty seriously, doesn't he? He takes it seriously. So in this suzerain vassal contract with Israel, God gave Israel the land as a permanent gift. As a permanent gift. You know why it's important for us today to support Israel's right to be on the land? Is because God gave Israel the land permanently. And 3,000 years later, Israel is the only country in history to be on their original land, speaking their original language. No other nation in the earth has ever succeeded like that. Because Israel, the land of the Middle East of Israel, belongs to Israel. He gave it to them permanently. No one else can declare ownership of the land of Israel. And we want to support God's plan, so therefore we support Israel's right to be the sole owner of the land of Israel, because God gave it to them as a permanent gift. But God retained the right, if need be, to remove Israel from the land, which he did, because he's the suzerain in the equation. God would always bring about restoration to Israel and the land. That's why in the suzerain-vassal relationship, the suzerain can't kick you off the land permanently and re-own the land, because they had given it to you forever. God has given Israel the land forever. God has the right to remove them off the land, but God always promised whenever he removed them off the land, he was going to restore them to the land. That's why in 1948, when Israel became a state again, Israel is returning as part of God's restoration plan, because they've been off the land for so long. All right? Does that make sense? That's why Nebuchadnezzar was given permission by God to come in and take the southern tribes away, because God had been after them for 400 years to stop being people of bad character and stop mistreating the land. All right? That's helpful. When Nebuchadnezzar came, there's 3 phases that he deported people. I think this is a little bit interesting and helpful for our discussion in Daniel. The first deportation came in 605 BC. That's Daniel chapter 1, 605 BC. The second deportation came in 597 BC, so about 8 years later. Another wave was taken off the land and taken to Babylon. And then finally, because the people of Babylon kept rebelling against Nebuchadnezzar, he finally came in 586 BC, and he destroyed Jerusalem. And if you want to read part of that story, it's a pretty horrific story that's recorded for us in 2 Kings. So they were off the land for 70 years. I was talking with somebody before our time together tonight, and it's like, when did the 70 years start? Did it start in 605? Did it start in 597? Did it start in 586? We do know that in 538, an edict to return the Jews to Jerusalem was given. So is that the end of the 70 years, or is it when Nehemiah actually went back to the land? We're not really sure where the window of the exact start of the 70 years and the end of the 70 years, but we do know that it's 70 years. Okay, so that's the time frame in history, 605 to 586 BC. Now, Daniel was taken in the first wave because he was a son of a noble family, and he was pretty good looking and pretty smart. And so he was taken in the first wave. And if we learn about Daniel, what's impressive about him as a person is that he served 4 different administrations. It's a pretty amazing feat to be in the president's cabinet, so to speak, for 4 different administrations that were different from each other. We know that Daniel was taken into captivity under Nebuchadnezzar. And by the way, I'm going to require that you know how to spell Nebuchadnezzar by the end of our class time. After Nebuchadnezzar passed away, Belshazzar took over, and he retained Daniel as a chief leader in the kingdom. Then the Medes and the Persians conquered the Babylonians. Darius the Mede came to power, and he also decided, after interviewing Daniel, this guy's worth keeping. Now that's impressive, isn't it? A whole new kingdom with a whole new king, and instead of wiping out all of his enemies, Darius decides to keep Daniel as a prominent figure in his administration. And then after Darius passed away, Cyrus succeeded him, and Daniel served in Cyrus's administration. Why is this important to know? It's important to know because it's such a blessing for Daniel. Here's what we know. Nebuchadnezzar was the king that brought Judah, the southern part of Israel, into captivity. So Daniel was there when his people were taken into captivity. Cyrus was the one that signed the decree for the people of Israel to return to the land. And so God allowed Daniel to see both the captivity and the return. And he kept him alive and sharp in 4 different administrations as a blessing from God that Daniel could both see the captivity and was alive when Cyrus signed the document allowing the Jews to return to the land. What a blessing. It shows you how sharp he is. So when we talk about Daniel, he's a very sharp guy. And he has not only great character, but he has great intelligence and intellect. Another very interesting part of Daniel, and maybe you don't know this might be new, is Daniel is actually written in 2 different languages. In the Old Testament, most of our Old Testament is written originally in what language? Hebrew or Aramaic. Okay? What's interesting about the book of Daniel is that it's written in both Hebrew and Aramaic. And what that tells us as readers is that God isn't just writing a book about Daniel. The book of Daniel is actually a message to people. Let me show you what we mean. In Daniel, chapters 1, and then we skip all the way to chapter 8 through chapter 12, which is the end of Daniel. So chapter 1 and chapters 8 through chapter 12 are written in Hebrew language, which tells us that this is God's message to the Jews. So whatever happens in chapter 1, chapter 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, we know it's God's message to the Jewish people because it's written in Hebrew and the rest of the world would not have understood the language. But what's very fascinating is that chapters 2 through 7, right kind of in the middle of the book of Daniel changes languages from Hebrew to Aramaic, which means chapters 2 through 7 is God's message to the world. It's not the message to the Jewish nation, so to speak. It's God's message to the nations of the earth. So when we walk through the book of Daniel, we're going to notice this difference. So when we study chapter 1, we're going to see this is God's message to the Jewish people. And what can we learn from it? As we go through chapters 2 through 7, we're going to ask ourselves the question, what is God's message to the world and to the nations? And then when we return to chapter 8 through the rest of the book, we're going to go back and ask ourselves the question, what is God's message to the Jewish people? Does that make sense? So we're going to make some shifts as we go because Daniel is written in 2 different languages. Now, if we just look at the Aramaic portion, we see something fascinating as well. In the ancient Near East, when you communicated messages, especially lengthy messages, you often used different kinds of writing. You know, in the ancient world, there was poetry. And poetry had a variety of kinds. You had the kind of poetry where the last word in every sentence would rhyme. You know, you had the kind of poetry where every other sentence would rhyme. You had the kind of poetry that had a certain rhythm to it that rhymed. Well, there's a very specific way in which chapters 2 through chapter 7 is written in the Aramaic language. We call it a chiastic model, which was familiar in the Old Testament. So let's look through this. This is how they would write. They would write things. Letter A, the big picture of the message is followed by B, a smaller point under that same point of the big picture. And then C is another point. And what we find in chapter 2 and chapter 3 and chapter 4, here's the message. The big picture message is God controls the future. Now, if we look in chapter 2, what's the main story of chapter 2? It's going to be this statue that Nebuchadnezzar dreams about. And this statue that we're going to look at in chapter 2 is a statue that represents the coming nations of the earth and how God is in control of them. Because remember, this is a message to the world. God is in control of the future. Even before any of those nations exist, God has already foretold what those nations are going to be like. So that tells us God's in control of the future. If you go to chapter 3, the message is God protects his people, because chapter 3, the main story is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And so Daniel purposely lines up these two stories because he is telling God's message to the world, and he's doing it in a language pattern. And then C, the sub point is letter C, God humbles the proud. And if we look at chapter 4, the story of Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the big tree, and Nebuchadnezzar goes crazy. And God takes the king of Babylon and makes him insane for a period of time, where he actually wanders around the forests acting like a wild animal until he comes to his senses. So that story is purposely placed as number 3, because Daniel is giving the message to the world that God's in control of the future, God protects his people, God humbles the proud. Now, are these good messages for us to learn as well? Sure. But this is, remember, they're in Aramaic, so they are God's message to the world. God wants the nations of the earth to know these truths. Now, what happens in chapters 5, 6, and 7 is that this same order is just reversed. That's the chiastic model. So we have another C, where God humbles the proud. And if we looked in chapter 5, we would see Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's successor, and the handwriting on the wall, God humbling Belshazzar and saying, you have been examined and you are lacking from God's perspective. God humbles the proud. And then the next story is God protects his people. In chapter 6, guess what that story is? The most famous story of Daniel is what? Daniel where? Daniel in the lion's den. And that story purposely follows the story of Belshazzar, because in the chiastic writing form, you needed to have a story about how God protects his people. And then finally, in chapter 7, God controls the future. And if we were able to if we were going to look at chapter 7, we see Daniel's vision. And in Daniel's vision, there's 4 beasts. And those 4 beasts also represent the 4 coming nations of the earth. Again, demonstrating God is declaring the nations before they're even in existence, because God controls the future. All right, does that make sense? So that helps us as we walk through Daniel. We're going to see that these stories, these are purposely chosen to show this chiastic format of God's message to the world. And the reason this was so wise to use is because it's a very clear message. It's repeated twice. So when the nations of the earth read the book of Daniel, they would go, oh, I'm reading in Aramaic, a language I'm familiar with, and the stories that are being told present a very clear message. God's in control of the future. God protects his people. God humbles the proud. God humbles the proud. God protects his people. God's in charge. God controls the future. Maybe I ought to consider following that God, not my gods. Okay? A very interesting part of the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, well, let me pause just for a minute here. We're on our way. We're halfway done. Any questions so far? Okay, yes, Carl.
If removing the Jews from the land has to do with abusing the land and the people not being moral, is it possible that God could remove the Jews from the land today for those same reasons?
Is it possible that God, because God removed Israel from the land because of their lack of character and mistreating the dirt, would God do that again? Could God do that again? Remember, when God gave Israel the land through Abraham, he gave it to them for all generations. And so the answer could be yes, he could do it again, because if they're doing that. Now, yes, so the answer is yes, he could do it again. Now, let's pause there just for a second, because let me ask this question. Has God made this kind of contract with anyone else in history that you can think of? Has God made a suzerain vassal land contract with any other nation in history? Did he make it with the Babylonians? Did he promise to keep them on their land? No. Did he make it, let's fast forward a little bit, did he make it with the Greeks? Did he make it with the Romans? No. Did he make it with the Persians? Let's fast forward a little bit. Did God make this contract with Germany or Austria? Did he make this contract with Italy or Spain or Russia? The answer is what? No. Did he make this contract with America? The answer is what? No. Okay? The only nation in the history of humanity that God made this contract with is Israel. And America is not Israel. So God does not make this promise to us. Okay? That's important for how we view our nation. Because sometimes we can take the promises made to Israel and somehow slip them into Christian America. Okay? The only group that God ever made this contract with is the people of Israel. So that's a good question. Somebody else. Tom? Okay, is Israel violating that land covenant now by giving away land for peace? Land for peace. Well, Daniel chapter 9 and 10 will talk about that. Okay, because we have to, in order to answer that question, we have to answer the question, where is Israel right now in God's plan? Okay, but the covenant of the land is still true. Okay, God can bring them back whenever he wants. And whenever he thinks there are people ready, and they'll treat the land right. Okay? Very good. Another question before we keep going? Yes? This is called a chiastic writing style. Okay? I put that in later. Maybe I didn't add it to your notes. Okay? Chiastic. Okay? Turn to your neighbor and say, chiastic. Okay? It's a Hebrew word, chiastic. All right? No, the chiastic model is not used in chapter 1 or in chapters 8 through 12. And I think the reason why is because the non-Jewish world would have understood this, because this was a common style of writing, and they would have got the message. Okay, if the nations of the world that spoke Aramaic read the stories in this sequence, they would have got the message, because they would have been familiar with that style of writing. Okay, yes? All right. Did you hear the question? The promise of God restoring the land of Israel, does that mean he's going to go back to the circle or just back to where he is today? I wish I could figure out how to do this. I'm not going to do it. It'll take me too long to find it again. Okay? All right? Well, does God keep his promises? Did he promise Abraham, I want you to stand on this mountain, and here's the land. From the river Euphrates to the sea, okay? And from here, as far as you can see. Does Israel occupy that land now? No. Was that God's promise? Yes. Okay? So that would lead me to indicate that there's going to come a time when God will give them all of that land, okay? Which means they're going to own Iraq and Iran. So they will have all of their what? Their oil. And Israel will become the most powerful nation on the earth. When does that happen? Come back next week. We'll find out when that happens. No, I believe that happens during God's millennial kingdom. When Jesus comes down and sets up his kingdom, he's not going to set up his kingdom just in that little tiny sliver of land. His kingdom's going to be all that land that he promised to him. All that land that he promised to him. All right, good questions. All right, let's keep going. Next in your notes is something very interesting. There's such a great variety of dreams and visions and edicts in the book of Daniel. As we go through it, we're gonna see some really fun stuff. We're gonna see the dream of the statue. Nebuchadnezzar then sets up a golden image in chapter 3, this huge statue right at the main crossroads of Babylon. And it's so big and tall, it's as tall as this ceiling almost. And you can see it for miles as you come in over the hills down into Babylon. And he told the people, when you hear the band strike up the music, you have to stop, get on your knees, and pray to that statue. Then we're going to see the vision of the tree, where Nebuchadnezzar has this vision about this tree that's so large, all the animals fit underneath it and the birds are living in it, and then somebody comes and cuts the tree down and puts a band around the stump, and then all of a sudden a little shoot grows up and it returns. There's going to be a fascinating study. Chapter 5, the edict on the wall, where Belshazzar is having this, remember in Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, we're told that all of the sacred vessels that were in the temple of Jerusalem were taken and brought into the temple of Nebuchadnezzar's god in Babylon. Belshazzar succeeds Nebuchadnezzar. He wants to have this big orgy feast and impress all of his friends and leaders, and they don't have enough utensils for the tables, so he tells people, go into the God's treasury and pull out all those treasury and put them out as the table settings, and now all of a sudden God's utensils from Jerusalem are being used in this incredible orgy fest to their gods, and all of a sudden God steps in and he says, no, we're not going to be doing that. So there's this writing on the wall. Then in chapter 6, we see the prayer edict where they were trying to trap Daniel, and Nebuchadnezzar's wise men who hate Daniel because he rose to power and he's a foreigner. They said to the king, "King, you're so awesome, we should make an edict that only people pray only to you for 30 days, knowing that Daniel wouldn't do it." Okay? And the king's like, wow, that's a brilliant idea. Okay? And so he signs the edict, and then they haul Daniel in, and Daniel gets thrown in the lion's den because of that. And then in chapter 4, we're going to see these 4 crazy beasts in this dream and vision that Daniel has. So just some really cool stuff in the book of Daniel. It's kind of sci-fi mixed with history and symbolism, and it's going to be a fun study as we walk through the book of Daniel. All right, lastly, in your notes for tonight, what are the purposes of the book? The purposes of the book. Number 1, to remind Israel to live holy lives among their captives in Babylon. Okay? Just because Israel was taken into captivity doesn't mean they stop following God the way that God wants them to follow him. Israel can't use their circumstances as an excuse to compromise in how they were following God. Isn't that a great lesson for us today? We can't use our difficulties as an excuse to stop doing what God wants us to do. He wants us to honor him with our lives in the midst of good times and in the midst of bad times. And one of the things he's telling the Israelites, the Jewish people, is, listen, I took you to Babylon. You're there because I brought you there. And you don't have an excuse to live unholy lives just because you're in an unholy place. Number 2, to demonstrate God's sovereign power over the kings and the nations of the earth. We're going to see in multiple places where God clearly demonstrates he's the king of the world. And he's in charge of nations, good and bad nations. He's in charge of nations that love him and nations that hate him. Kings don't get to do anything without God's permission. And any edict or any plan that kings try to bring forth has to go through the filter of God's plans. And if they don't fit the plans of God, God prevents them from happening. Isn't that good for us to know today? Lots of things going on in our country, in our world. We do what we can. We pray, we vote, we speak up with our freedoms. But ultimately, nothing can happen in our nation without the filter of God's control to fulfill his ultimate plans. What's going on around the world today and the way that the direction of the world is heading, I think we're heading quickly to the return of Jesus, but he's still in control. He's still sovereign. And then finally, the book of Daniel is to provide encouragement to Israel and a hope for future restoration. One of the things that God does in chapters 8 through 12, when Daniel prays, God, I'm so tired of this. When are you going to bring us back to the land? God answers his prayer and tells Daniel the timeline of the restoration of Israel, both in the short term and in the long term. And so it gives Daniel and his nation hope, So God always wants to provide encouragement to Israel and a hope for the future restoration. Because that's the suzerain-vassal contract. The suzerain can kick you off the land, but the suzerain can never repossess the land and keep you from coming back. And so God was always telling Israel, I'm taking you off, but I'm bringing you back. And they brought them back for the short term, and then after Rome conquered Jerusalem, they were scattered to the four corners of the earth, and they were off their land for, 1,500 years. And in 1948, God starts to bring them back. And now they're coming back in droves. And I think we're setting up to see God's ultimate fulfillment of the suzerain-vassal contract, where now he's letting them back on the land because they're going to turn back to the Lord and they're going to treat the land right. All right, that's our lesson for tonight, okay? Any questions? Yes, Tom? A parallel between Joseph and Daniel. Yes, that's a good point. Daniel, here's the difference. Joseph was sold into captivity right by his brothers. He was taken into Egypt. He was successful for a long time in Potiphar's house, and then the wife of Potiphar falsely accused him. He went to jail for how long? 13 years, okay? And then he became Pharaoh's right-hand person. So in a sense, that same pattern that we see, the difference between Israel and Joseph is Joseph didn't do anything wrong to deserve it, and Israel did, okay? So he wasn't part of that contract. Yes? Say that again? Yeah, we don't think Daniel ever returned. God's grace in Daniel's life was allowing him to serve under King Cyrus, where he saw the edict that Israel could return to be signed, but he never actually returned. Okay? Good. Somebody else?
Is the suzerain-vassal contract used widespread? Were people very aware of that?
Yes, that's a good question. Was a suzerain-vassal contract a widespread typical agreement in the ancient Near East? Yes. Okay? That's why people would have clearly understood the rules. Israel would have clearly understood the rules when God initiated with Abraham the suzerain-vassal contract, because it was common even among the example that I gave. Okay? Farmers could do that. All right? Very good. Any other questions? Good job, everybody, after such a big, heavy meal. Okay? Thanks so much for coming, and there's dessert out on the courtyard. We're a little bit early, so it may not be out there yet, but hang in there, and they'll be bringing it right out. Thanks for coming tonight, okay?